For this lesson, you're going to want your front and back bodice, as well as the sleeve, all cut out in muslin. Your fabric scissors, some thread snips, pins, your pencil, a sewing ruler. We'll also need an extra piece of paper, 2 different color sewing threads. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And of course, you're going to want to have your sewing machine, your iron, and ironing board. During this lesson, when we sew up the bodice, what we're going to do is we're going to use 2 different color threads. And the reason being is because there's a couple different stitches that we're going to do on this, and I want you to know the difference between the 2. Once you've gone through this whole process for the first time, follow me exactly like I'm doing it. And then as you go through the second and third and fourth time, you can go ahead and just use 1 color of thread. Now when I'm working here in muslin, what I don't want to do is I don't want to use a neutral tone thread. The reason being is these colors are so close to the color of the muslin that it's hard to see the threads. And what we're doing for a test fit, it's actually important to see where the threads are, because we're going to use the threads to draw all of our seam lines, and later on when you want to do adjustments, you'll know exactly where the threads are on your muslin. For the 2 different colors, I want something that's a cool color and a warm color, so there's a big difference between the 2. The 2 colors that I'm going to be using is blue and orange. The main thing is I want a darker cool color and a lighter warm color. If you don't have these exact colors, it's okay. You could also use red or a pink, a darker pink for this side. And then for the blues, if you had different shades of blue or green, or potentially you had purple or black. So again, the colors I'm going to stick with is blue and orange. And inside my bobbin, I'm going to fill this with blue as well. So let's go on over and we're going to set up our sewing machine now. Alright, so let's take a few minutes here and set up our sewing machine. The sewing needle that you're going to want to use will be a universal needle, which is also the same thing as a general purpose machine needle. The size that we're going to be using is going to be size anywhere from 9 through 11. So 9, 10, or 11. Or it also might say 65, 70, or 75. Now for me, I'm going to go ahead and use size 9. And I'm using a brand new needle because I want something that's really sharp and thin, just for starting a new project. Let's also go ahead and set it up where we're going to wind a bobbin using your darker contrast color, that is the cool color. So blue, black, purple, green. And let's go ahead and set up our machine with the blue thread on the top and the bottom. Now for me, when I very first put in a new needle, I set up some thread, everything's ready to go. I always don't trust it at first. And what I want to do is I want to check the tensions on my machine. Now the best way to do this is using just a plain piece of paper. So come under your machine and set up the stitch length somewhere in the middle. Usually it has some kind of a recommendation between like 3 and 4, so just go ahead and leave it right there. And what we're going to do is we're going to start sewing on this piece of paper, and don't do any back tacks or anything. Then we can come around here and we can start looking at the threads. So I'm looking at the thread here on the top to see if anything is looping up, which would mean my bobbin tension is too loose. And when I flip this over, I'm looking at the threads here to see if anything is looping up, then that means my upper tension is too loose. So on this machine, both of them are nice and flat and they look great. Another thing you want to notice is at each location where the machine poked a hole, you want to make sure that all you see is just a poked hole. If you see these little tears, like so there's a short distance, so for instance each one instead of being a hole is like a short tear, which means both of them, your upper and lower tensions are too tight and it's tearing the paper. What's going to happen is on your fabric, it's going to shrink your pattern pieces as you're sewing. So if you have to make any adjustments, the first thing I would do is I would adjust just the upper tension and see if that fixes it. If it doesn't, then at some point you might need to also adjust the tension on your bobbin. In every machine, adjusting the tension is a little bit different, so you'll have to go back and read the manual and find out. Now, if this looks pretty good, what I'll do is I'll bump this all the way up as large of a stitch as it will go. So for instance, on this machine, it's 6. And then again, I'll just come back and I'll look at it. And here, it would be really obvious if the upper or the lower tension was off. You would have these really loose loops on here. When you're done sewing and you're ready to take this out of the machine, you want to be really careful that you don't just start pulling on your paper or your fabric, because again, it's just going to tear the paper, which is the same as it will start to pull a little bit on your fabric. So you have to make sure that your fingers are holding where that thread is as you're pulling this out from under the machine. So just make sure that your tensions look perfect. There's no tearing on your paper, and you know that everything is set for your machine and we're ready to go. Another thing that you're going to want to check on your machine is where exactly is 1/2 inch. The reason being is all of our seam allowance we did was 1/2 inch. When you come over to the plate on some sewing machines, sometimes it's in centimeters and millimeters. So it'll say 25, 20, 15, 30, and this is all millimeters. Sometimes it'll say 3/8, 5/8, 1 inch, but it actually doesn't even have a line for 1/2 inch. Now what I'll do is, just so you can see this a little bit better, I'll put some white paper behind here. So you can see when I bring in the ruler, I'm lining up the 1/2 inch from my ruler, and I'm making sure that the needle itself is going to hit right on that 1/2 inch mark. Then I can check out here on the side of the machine to see if one of these lines on here already matches up, and that's your 1/2 inch line. If this isn't the case, if you don't have anything that matches up, or you feel like you don't quite trust it, what I would do is take a piece of tape, lay it down, set up your ruler along with the needle, and then you can use a pencil, or for instance, I used a bright red marker to draw right along the edge of the ruler. Then when you pull this away, put another piece of tape down on top of that marker so it doesn't smudge or smear. And now you'll have a perfect line that's exactly 1/2 inch. And you'll always know that you'll bring the raw edge of your fabric right up to the edge of that line. But you should still be able to see that line as you're sewing, because the line itself was just on the outside edge of the 1/2 inch. The last thing we want to do is, for this dial right here, we want to have this set to where we're stitching 12 stitches per inch. Now on this dial, there's no setting for 12 stitches per inch. What we need to do is we need to sew, measure it, and adjust the dial accordingly. So take out your blank piece of paper, and wherever the dial is, so for instance, we had it in between 3 and 4. I'm going to just put mine on 3. Sew for a short distance, and then come around, and with your ruler, we're going to physically measure this. So find 1 stitch, and then start measuring for 1 inch. So for me, I have 7 stitches per inch when my setting is on 3. So if I want more, I want this to be 12. So I'm going to make this dial smaller. So I'm going to go from 3 heading down towards 2. So then I'll come down, I'll put another mark here right at the needle. I'll continue sewing. So now I can come back and measure this one. And it's just a little too long, so I'm going back one click. So basically now it's set up at 12 stitches per inch. So now that I found 12 stitches per inch, I want to know where this is on the dial. For me, it's pretty simple. I have the lines right here showing you the center of the dial. And for me, it's right at that number 2. So that's pretty easy. For you, if it's in a weird spot, like somewhere in between 2 and 3 or 1 and 2, if you want, you can always put a little piece of tape on your dial and put a mark here for today. So wherever it ended up for you. Later on during the lesson, we're also going to be using a large basting stitch. So you're going to need to know exactly where that dial hit. Now when we sew up our project in muslin, we're going to be doing a lot of techniques that you would use for fine dressmaking or anything that is dry clean only. One of the things that we're going to do is we are not going to use any back tacking. And since we're not going to back tack, there's a couple habits that you need to make sure you're using every time that we start sewing. I want you to try this with me now. So again, make sure your threads are as long as your longest finger. Bring them through the machine and to the back. Bring your paper underneath here. Put your foot down. And for the first 2 stitches, you have to be holding this thread here in the back. Now as you're stitching, you don't want to hold your fabric so you're not stretching it or pushing it into the machine. It's really important that the machine is pulling the fabric through according to each and every stitch. What you do want to do though is you want to make sure that the raw edge is staying perfectly lined up with your 1/2 inch mark. So the only time I'm touching this is to make sure that that edge is staying right here. And then again, at the end of the stitch, when you take this out of the machine, you have to hold the threads. So the threads that are here on the fabric or on the paper, you have to hold it there as you pull this out of the machine. The reason we do not do a back tack at the beginning or the end is because if this stitch is starting to shrink your pattern piece when we do this in muslin, you're still able to come in here and get this thread to relax back out into the edges and get your original shape of your pattern perfect. And you'll see this more as we go when we start sewing.